Hi, class. We're talking about world history, chapter 21, semester 2, the concept of imperialism. So, we do have a couple of key terms here: imperialism, indigenous, viceroy, nonviolent resistance, Creole, and Monroe Doctrine, and these take place over the course of the entire chapter. Imperialism being the main topic, I'm going to go ahead and read that one. The extension of one nation's powers over another. Basically, one country being the bully and somebody else being the victim. And why are they going to be the bully? Basically because they need something. And that's exactly what's going to happen all over Africa, inside of Asia and Latin America. And essentially the United States was established as colonies as well due to imperialism, just a little earlier than the time that we're looking at right now. We're going to be looking at what we call the 19th century, also known as the 1800s. So I always like to read a little intro from your book, and here's section 1, basically looking at Southeast Asia. The 19th century saw the emergence of new imperialism in Asia and Africa. By establishing overseas colonies, Western powers saw an opportunity to improve their access to both raw materials and new markets for their manufactured goods. Racism, social Darwinism, and the white man's burden all helped Westerners justify colonization. Virtually all of Southeast Asia came under the control of Great Britain, France, and the United States. Only Thailand stayed independent. Colonial powers ruled either indirectly, relying mainly on the local elites, or directly by sending a governor. Although some local people profited from the colonial arrangement, most suffered from the harsh conditions of plantation work. Resistance movements sought to protect the local economic and religious interests, but were crushed under the colonial powers. Later, Western educated elites led resistance movements to a new goal of national independence. So, when we are looking at these concepts, the ones that it's describing here, of course, are from section 1 of your book. Look at the cartoon to the right as I read. With industrialism, Western nations began to look to Asia and Africa as a source of raw materials. What are raw materials? Well, look at your candy bar, look at the ingredients, and when you look at those ingredients, where do they come from? Do they all come from Las Vegas? Is it assembled here in a plant? Of course not. What happens is that those raw materials are found in many different parts of the United States, or many different parts of the world. So, for example, if you need cocoa, then you need to find a place where that's grown, where the cocoa beans are grown. And if we can control that instead of buying them off of somebody, and we can produce them ourselves in that nation, then that's going to save money. Colonial nations desired political and economic control of the nations, and strategic and religious concerns also came into play. In other words, they wanted their religion to be spread over the entire United States, over the entire world. Now, the white man's burden, if you look at a picture there to the left, as I read to the right, colonial efforts justified by the following. So these people back then in the 1800s were feeling that we really have to do this to the rest of the world. And why? Because these people are uncivilized. Of course, the people who they thought were uncivilized felt that they were perfectly civilized and that these were invaders coming in to ruin their lives. They also had a desire to spread Christianity, and they felt, even if they might have ignored Darwinism as an ape-to-man theory of evolution, social Darwinism was the concept where one race of people or one group of people had evolved socially over time and placed them in control over those other people. Now, sometimes that could be looked upon as the way that socially they have arranged their government was of greater desire than the way that somebody in Africa or Asia had organized their government, and so that they could come in and take over. Critics charged Europeans and Americans with using a double standard: freedom of rights at home, but none for their colonial possessions. So as I talk about this particular map, you guys can see some of the different things: the coffee, the palm oil, the rubber, and the spices. Obviously, eventually they're going to start using rubber for tires on cars, and this comes into play where the rubber is grown from rubber tree plants during World War II as well. Sugar and tea, timber, tin, many different things were grown in this area of Southeast Asia. So, who controlled these particular areas? You can again see it on your map by color, and I will go ahead and read it. Great Britain developed colonies in Singapore, which is a city, Burma, which is now Myanmar, New Guinea, and in India. In France, France developed colonies in Indochina, Vietnam now, and Cambodia and Laos. Thailand was called Siam. Maybe you've seen the picture of the Siamese twins that were conjoined at the abdomen area. They were, of course, from Siam. This is an exception because the kings of Siam managed to be smart enough to keep control for themselves. Spain controlled the Philippines for a while, but then the U.S. took control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. If you can see the explanations of direct rule and indirect rule, the officials from the mother country controlled the land. So, for example, there was direct rule in Burma and southern Mekong, and then indirect rule, local leaders maintained their control in North Vietnam or the Dutch East Indies. So we have a little bit of a review here of indirect and direct rule. You can go ahead and see the picture over to the right showing the fleet of the Dutch East Indian trading ships. Some of the problems of imperialism listed below, well, it demeaned the local people because we're telling them that whoever is taking control is better than them. It abused the natural resources by not leaving them with the people that live there, but taking them out to create the products that the mother country wanted to create. It persecuted local religions such as Confucianism, Buddhism, or whatever religions were found in the area. It stole the profits of the exports from that area, and it caused a huge amount of animosity, which is hatred or anger of East versus West, establishing the future world wars that ended up happening. Also, for example, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. So you can see some of the many problems of imperialism. So obviously, many of the Asian people were unhappy with the treatment at the hands of the colonial rulers, and there were resistance and revolts that occurred throughout Asia. Economic and religious issues, not nationalism, generally were the focus of the resistance. Who fought colonialism? Well, monarchs fought the foreign rule, peasants fought against foreign rule, and educated westernized people also fought, based upon nationalism usually. Now, our next slide is going to be those review questions that I told you we would be placing in the PowerPoint during the second semester, and you can see these two different review questions from section 1. Discussing the phase of imperialism during the 1800s was different because of the European states sought direct control over vast territories. And which of the following forms of resistance was not undertaken against colonial rule in Southeast Asia? Well, in Southeast Asia, sit-down strikes and other means of passive resistance were not taken. We're going to move on to Section 2, Empire Building in Africa. European control over Africa began with the British annexations in West Africa. After 1880, great power rivalries prompted France, Germany, Portugal, and even the tiny country of Belgium and Italy to begin seeking territory in Africa. In Egypt, an Ottoman army officer named Muhammad Ali set up an independent state and began modernizing the country. Great Britain's interest in the Suez Canal, which is located just east of Egypt, led to Egypt's establishment of the British as a British protectorate. Belgium and French staked claims to lands around the Congo River in Central Africa, while Germany, despite the reluctance of Bismarck, claimed territories in West and East Africa. British involvement in southern Africa led to the Boer War against the descendants of the 17th century Dutch settlers, also known as Afrikaners, and then to the establishment of the Union of South Africa. Resentment of local colonial powers led to the emergence of nationalist movements, especially as a new class of educated middle-class Africans began to point to hypocrisies, discriminatory nature of the colonial rule. Colonialization in Africa. Please look at the map to the right as I go ahead and read the information on the left. Prior European involvement in Africa limited to coasts, basically because there were different diseases that people would get as they entered into Africa, one of which would kill the horses, so they were unable to travel all the way into the center. Africa is completely carved up between 1880 and 1900. Why? Desire for prestige, raw materials, strategic lands drove imperialism. And of course, that Suez Canal gave a more direct route to India, which was controlled by the British government as well. African efforts to resist colonization are met with European might. For example, when you have a gun that can fire more rapidly that was invented by somebody that lived in Great Britain, then that gives the control of the area. In the Sudan in 1898, they had many Muslim deaths, and look at the British deaths by comparison. So looking at the map to the right, you can see which countries controlled the modern countries. They, of course, had different names back then than they do today, but you can see Egypt up there to the right, and you can see it was under British control. Now, just a breakdown to who controlled what. If we look at North, Central, East, and South Africa as geographical areas. So in the north, that is where Egypt exists. It was controlled by Muhammad Ali and the Ottoman Empire. And then Ferdinand de Lesseps contracted to build the Suez Canal in 1869. In 1914, Egypt was a British protectorate, and the French controlled Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. You can see the picture down at the bottom as to where the Suez Canal is. In Central Africa, we have Dr. Livingstone, who should have an E at the end of his name there, explored, and when he disappeared, the New York Times sent Henry Stanley to find him. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, is a famous quote that Henry Stanley said upon seeing him. It's a very interesting story. He took many notes and was there for several years, and you guys will be doing a reading of his diary when you go into the review section for this chapter. Belgium even colonized an area at the urging of Stanley, and the Congo was the area controlled by Belgium. East. Britain and Germany controlled that particular area. Portugal and Belgium also colonized. And in the south, most heavily influenced by Europeans. Boers, of course, are the descendants of Dutch people. As I told you before, they are called the Afrikaners. The British started to take over control from the Boers. Boers did not like that. The Boers had moved further north, and they had fought the Zulu, one of the most famous being Shaka Zulu. There is a movie actually called Shaka Zulu as their leader, and the Zulu kept their control of the area. Eventually, we also meet a person named Cecil Rhodes, who found his wealth in gold and diamonds. Eventually, Rhodesia is named after him, and he kind of has a rise and fall of power, and he kind of was an instigator that brought along that Boer War. It's very famous when you watch movies from this particular, when they reflect on this particular time period. They're always sending British people off to South Africa to fight in this particular war. And of course, most of them died. Many more from disease than anything else, because there was African sleeping sickness, malaria, all types of things that would kill them off as they went there from an environment completely different from what they had in England. So as I discussed on the last slide, this is just some review of South Africa. We talked about the Boers and the Afrikaners and the Boer War itself and the Zulu people. I just wanted you to see the picture to the right of that particular war. And then, of course, a flag of the African nationalism. Some students would come to me and say, I want to do my country report on Africa. And I'd have to remind them that Africa is a continent. It is not a country. It is made up of several separate countries. And those people from those separate countries have their own nationalism, and they would never think of themselves as Africans. They might think of themselves as Ethiopians or Egyptians or Algerians or Moroccans. So make sure that you know the distinction between a continent and a country when in referring to Africa. In South Africa itself, the concept of apartheid comes out of this era and goes all the way down to your lifetime. It was not taken apart. It was not removed until the 1990s. And with the end of that section comes another practice and review questions. Colonial powers justified their action is basically all of those things. A desire to help the uncivilized, desire to spread Christianity and social Darwinism. The French controlled the colonies in which part of Asia? In Indochina. And then the bottom question, the European presence in Africa grew most rapidly in South Africa, where many indigenous people were put on reservations. Isn't it great when the telephone rings while you're making a recording? So we are on to section 3, British rule in India. The British controlled India at first through the British East India Company, which had its own forts and soldiers. A revolt led by Indian soldiers prompted the British government to appoint a British viceroy to rule the country. The British developed India economically, building railroads and creating an education system for the upper class, yet Indians paid a high price for British rule. British manufactured goods destroyed local industry. The abuses of tax collectors and the superior British attitude and lifestyle caused many Indians to resent the British. The Indian National Congress, made up of mostly Hindus, led for the reform. A Muslim League was later formed to represent Muslim concerns. The most prominent Indian leader was Mahatma Gandhi, a Western-educated lawyer who advocated non-violent resistance as a way to gain independence. Tense relations with the British led to an Indian cultural revival. In 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny. The mutiny was a result of various grievances. However, the flashpoint was reached when the soldiers were asked to bite off the paper cartridges for their rifles, which were greased in animal fat, namely beef and pork. Well, this was and is against the religious beliefs of the Hindus and Muslims. So, obviously, according to these things, it was a conflict of interest between the British and the Indians. The Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, revolted. As a result, British Parliament transfers control of India directly to the British government. Colonial rule in India, well, the British rule directly through the Viceroy and civil service. British set up a school system and develop infrastructure. Peace and stability at the cost of freedom of rights of the Indian people, though. Now, if you look at this particular slide, it's discussing the benefits and the costs of colonial rule in India. So the benefits, some might say, brought order and stability to a country that was not so orderly and stable prior to them getting there, and giving them a structure of government, a new school system, and of course, railroads, telegraphs, and postal services were established. But was it worth it? Look at that list on the left. It is much shorter than the one on the right. Loss of economic power to foreigners. British textiles, where the women used to work, were put out of business. The Zamindars collected the taxes and abused their powers to do so. Cash crops instead of food crops. What that means is if you're told, for example, like in the southern states, to grow tobacco, you can't eat tobacco, you can only sell tobacco. So in India, it was to produce cotton instead of producing food. The best of everything was basically given to the Britons, and the Indians were never considered equal. Basically, their skin color was a disadvantage for them. One of the most famous Indians is, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian nationalist that worked towards reforms of the British system. Eventually, the nationalists pushed for the ousting of the British completely. The lawyer, Mahatma Gandhi, he was using nonviolent resistance to push for independence. Of course, the Reverend Martin Luther King also sought to use Gandhi's style in order to bring about change in the United States in the 1960s. And here is our review slide for Section 3. If you're looking at this review slide, one of these questions will be found in your review. Which of the following is not among the harmful effects of British rule in India? Indian school-aged children were not allowed to attend school. Great Britain saw the Suez Canal primarily as what? Its lifeline to India. And Mahatma Gandhi called for Indians to use nonviolent resistance to win independence. Let's move on to Section 4. National building in Latin America, our nearest neighbor. After the Napoleonic Wars, Spanish and Portuguese authority in Latin America became weak. A slave revolt in Hispaniola, quote, Haiti, believe it or not, was the first of many successful bids for independence. Many Europeans favored the restoration of Spanish control, but the American Monroe Doctrine and British naval power discouraged European intervention. Caudillos, or strong leaders backed by military force, took power throughout Latin America. American settlers in the Mexican state of Texas gained independence and, later, American statehood. Great Britain and later the United States became the dominant foreign power. In the Spanish-American War, the United States gained control of Cuba and Puerto Rico. American investment and military intervention in Latin America grew. Revolution in Mexico produced a new reformist constitution. However, the new professional sector in Latin American society was generally conservative and allied itself with long-holding elites. And again, here is an overview of many of the places found in Latin America. First, a few definitions to the left: Peninsulares, Creoles, and Mestizos. Peninsulares were the top of the social class. They were only here temporarily, or in Latin America temporarily, and they were Spanish and Portuguese. The Creoles were the first generation Europeans, so they were born in Latin America, but they were of European descent. Whereas the Mestizos were a blended group. They were blended with the Indian and the European blood, and they typically worked as laborers and servants. They were, of course, the largest group. Now, if you look across at the chart, it is Mexico, Haiti, Cuba, and then, of course, all of South America. In Mexico, we have Miguel Hidalgo, who is a priest, and on September 16th, 1810, the Mestizos rose up against the Spanish, but were crushed. Then Agustin de Iturbide, Emperor of Mexico, became Emperor of Mexico in 1822. In Haiti, it was originally called Hispaniola. The revolt led to Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture, where the slaves rose up to take control, the first independent state in Latin America. So, Haiti was the first independent state in Latin America. Cuba, war with the U.S. in 1898. The U.S. received Puerto Rico as a result. In the deal in 1903, the U.S. reported the rebellion from Colombia that gave the U.S. the location of 10 miles on either side of where the Panama Canal was, and that's how they started work on the Panama Canal. South America, Jose de San Martin from Argentina and Simón Bolívar from Venezuela led several revolts to free South American countries from control of Spain and Portugal. By 1824, Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile were free from Spain. In 1822, Brazil was free from Portugal. Your book will give you some more details on all of the events. If you look at this particular slide, you can see some of the individuals just discussed. Ideals of American Revolution spur others in Latin America to seek independence. The local people of Mexico and Bolivia revolt against their colonial masters. And then, of course, the Haitian revolt against their leaders from France. If you look, the Monroe Doctrine is, of course, one of the most important documents in American history because we have used it several times, even as recently as the 1960s, to keep foreign interests out of the Western Hemisphere. So that is something that is still used. We used it against the USSR when they were bringing missiles and housing them in Cuba. U.S. makes an effort to keep friendly leaders in power. Revolutionary Emiliano Zapata rallies peasants to overthrow the Mexican government in 1920. And here is our Section 4 review. Section 4 review. The Monroe Doctrine sought to protect U.S. interests in all of Latin America. Latin American Creoles were Latin Americans of European descent. Which of the following was known as liberators of South America? Simón Bolívar. And then, despite independence, old trade patterns reemerged with Latin Americans serving as a source of raw materials and foodstuffs for Britain and the United States. Our final slide today is just a review of imperialism. You can see who owned what in Southeast Asia, Africa, and India, obviously not showing anything from Latin America. So you can see the prominent force in all of these endeavors would, of course, be Britain. My husband comes from New Zealand, and even his country was controlled by the British, as well as Australia. I hope this helps you guys to understand imperialism a little bit better.